So apparently, I had some technical issues, and I recorded a ton of audio for this video today. After spending the whole day, typing up documents and get it all ready, and the release time's coming out, and I lost all the footage. It just, it made the recording sound, but apparently it didn't work. So instead of me having to re-record it and release it at a later date with my face, I realized my face isn't super important to the story. So instead, I've decided to be a furry for one episode. You're going to have to deal with Dylan Cat today. Meow meow. Meow meow. After the raid on Trump's home in Florida, there's been a huge spike of rhetoric online talking about a civil war and people encouraging violence on the streets and the overthrow of the American government. And so this has caused a lot of talk and discussion of, is the second civil war coming? Is this 1860 and we're standing on the precipice of another bloody episode in American history? Let's talk about it. Recently, there's been a huge spike on TikTok of people threatening to go and overthrow the American government and starting a civil war and talking about they're ready to, go and kill their neighbors. Personally, I don't pay much attention to TikTok, but this kind of blew up on Twitter. There was a big thread of 50 to 60 people talking about going and overthrowing the presidency because Donald Trump got his house raided. And I could just imagine them talking to either federal investigators and them talking to their wives or their husbands saying, hey, actually, I want to go martyr myself in public in front of everybody because the former host of The Apprentice was not able to keep top security clearance documents of a national security priority in his home. Documents that could endanger our nation's security because he couldn't keep it in his beach resort. I'm going to go kill myself by throwing myself at the American military. Here's a few clips of that.
Well, hey, don't mind me. Just getting ready for my IRS audit. I know this is about to come. Listen, I'm just like you. I've seen what happened to Trump. Yeah, it's go time. Everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. The Democrat Nazis have gone too far. Just look at what they've said in the Senate in the past. Look at all the ammunition the IRS is buying up. Look at the new classification they come out with the MBEs. I fit that description quite nicely. Yeah, if you followed me on my other account, follow me on this one as well. Don't let them shut me up. Every time I come across one of you who have lost your account due to the Democrat Nazis on the Democrat Nazi app, I follow you.
I'm going to just put this out there. I had a few people comment on my post and my brother's post. He's also the co-leader of a militia that we started, which, by the way, already has members, and people lining up. Now, religion aside, we don't believe in being segregated, so we don't care if you're black, white, Asian, Norse pagan, Christian, Buddhist, trans, gay, lesbian. We don't fucking care because we accept anybody who is willing to fight for the Constitution and for the American people. Now, to those who are wolves, those who are willing to stand up and fight, please follow. Please stand with us. We welcome you. And for those who are sheep, who don't want to stand, who want to trust in their government that has already failed them multiple times, and who want to bend the knee, stay the fuck off my page. I don't need sheep on my page. I need wolves that will stand with me so that we might fight this corrupt government, these corrupt cops, every fucking corrupt person in this country, and bring our country back to the glory it once was. The United States of America is no longer the United States of America, and we're no longer the greatest country in the fucking world. We are actually nowhere close. We don't lead when it comes to anything. So, just that being said, our freedom is a fucking lie. And the government's corrupt. They control everything about us, and they don't care about us. And voting has already been proven to be fake. Doesn't fucking matter. Biden would have gotten elected if the votes were real. I mean, 14 million votes over fucking night. Yeah, fucking right. Wake the fuck up. But, that being said, doesn't matter what I believe. It just means that if you're willing to stand for this Constitution and fight with the rest of us, you're a wolf. If you're not, and you want to bend the knee, you're a sheep, and you need to stay off my page and my brother's. because you're not welcome here. Now, if you're a sheep and one day you wake up and you become a wolf, you're more than welcome to join us. We don't care about your past, whoever you are, unless you're a pedophile. All we care about is the fact that you're willing to stand with us and fight for the Constitution and the...
Dear Combat Area Commandment Generals, there's 12 of you guys. You are witnessing open treason against your country. We, the people, ask you to do something about it. Now, I know a couple things that most Americans don't know. There's only two people that give you orders: Secretary of Defense, the President of the United States, who was known to have committed treason when we all found out about it during the Trump-Ukrainian phone call. The public has known about Biden's treason since 2019. How long have you guys known about it? Now, you combat area commanders, 11 of you are Trump appointees. Charles Flynn, you were appointed by Biden. But I know you're still a loyalist. We have 12 generals that are loyal to Trump. The Secretary of State and the President of the United States are the two only people that could tell them what to do. They run the whole military. What I am getting at, combat area commanders, there's only two people that stand in the way of bringing freedom to your country. Please bring justice.
Now, I know that these people are silly, that they're stupid, they're idiotic, and they want to martyr themselves for a silly cause. But the topic of civil war in the United States, that of a second civil war, is not a new one. There's been a lot of polling being released recently, like talking about how, people are quite scared, actually, of a second civil war coming about. And some people are actually encouraging secession, which would, of course, cause a civil war because there's no legal way for a state to secede. Let's talk about a few of those polling numbers. 50% of Republicans and 40% of Democrats at least somewhat agree that it's time to split up the country, favoring blue and red states seceding from the Union. 76% of respondents think political instability within the country is a bigger danger to the United States than external adversaries. Now, that's an interesting statistic because I would agree with it 100%. I've said this before, that I think the biggest national security threat to the United States is climate change and Americans. But I would also say that other nations like Russia understand that our biggest national security threat is not only climate change, but of course our own citizens. And they've actually poured tons of money into spreading disinformation and trying to encourage extremists to get out on the street and, become more extreme so they can cause discontent at home, cause chaos in America, therefore upsetting our geopolitical position abroad and helping them in places like Ukraine, where they're engaged in a brutal war of conquest. 53% of the same people polled expect political divisions in this country to worsen over their lifetime rather than get better. A separate poll found that 50% of Americans expect a civil war to happen in the next few years. When asked to respond to the statement, "In the next few years there will be a civil war in the United States," 47.8% of respondents said, "I don't agree." But 36.4% said they somewhat agreed with the statement, 8.4% agreed strongly with the statement, and 5.3% agreed very strongly with the statement. Altogether, it would be actually it would be like 50.1, so this article headline is technically correct, very technically. More than 2/3 of respondents agreed that there is a serious threat to our democracy, while more than 40% indicated that having a strong leader for America is more important than having a democracy. That last statistic is probably the most concerning to me, because the rest of them is just them talking about percentages of a civil war happening, which doesn't necessarily actually indicate the percentage chance of a civil war happening. because, of course, like, not everybody's a national security expert or expert on terrorism or civil conflict inside nation states or have knowledge studying the Syrian civil war or something. A lot of them are just average Joes. But that 40% wanting a strong leader more than democracy, that's the most concerning part of the study. But I do want to say that this study has not been peer-reviewed, so don't take this specific study as gospel, and don't use it as a first source when talking about this. And about those people who actually want to secede in the Union, this isn't a necessarily partisan political issue. While it's mostly divided up on the right, most of the people who want to secede from the Union are the right wing of the country. There are Democrats who also want to secede from the country. Here's an example of someone on the right and left actually advocating for secession in just the last 2 years. On the right, you have George Mason University's F.H. Buckley, who published the American Secession article, arguing that the United States is ripe for secession and there's much to be said for an American breakup. On the left, you have the Nation's Richard Kedder, who wrote Break It Up, contending that we must finally finish the work of Reconstruction or give up on the Union entirely. I will say that that second example, when it says finish the work of Reconstruction, I agree with him, but I would not entertain the idea of ever giving up on the Union, and I don't think that would really help the civil rights struggle or finish the process of Reconstruction any faster. So it's not exactly a call for secession, but it does entertain it. What finally pushed me to make a video about a possible civil war in the United States was actually an article in The Atlantic by Tim Alberta titled What Comes After the Search Warrant, which was specifically talking about the response to the search warrant and the people who went out and started committing violence and the people who went out and, started calling for civil war. And he specifically says in the article, the country is tracking towards a scale of political violence not seen since the Civil War. He then goes on to say, if America is a powder keg, then one overreach by the government, real or perceived, could light the fire. So, why do people think all of a sudden that a civil war is coming in America? Why is there a decent percentage of the population that actually believes that this is a likely possibility? Well, first off, once again, the FBI raid is something that has spiked dialogue in it recently. Again, we can maybe play a few more of those right-wing TikToks in response. Oh my God, aren't they juicy?
So yesterday I decided to run my name on the DOD's website, do a background check on myself, and I'm proud to say that I am on the FBI, CIA, Interpol, and the DOJ's watch list. Same thing, our forefathers were considered extremists. They actually killed their children, the Brits did, because they signed the Declaration of Independence. They sacrificed so much for our freedoms today that are getting stripped away. Okay, by the alphabet mafia, by the pronoun mafia, by my feelings mafia, and by a tyrannical government that are overstepping their bounds for many, many years now. Okay? So I'm doing the right thing by speaking out against them. That's how you know, because I'm on their watch list. They don't want us to be a republic. They want to keep us a controlled democracy. Fuck them.
Things are going to get really messy, but we're getting close, so should be somewhat happy. Just look at what's going on.
In this new bill they just drew up, the one about the guns and all that good stuff, they've included in it $80 billion set aside to pay IRS agents to come and take our weapons. It's going to be the IRS coming to do it. Well. You want to know how to combat this? Stop paying your taxes. If 100,000 people got together, if 50,000 people got together and quit paying taxes, another million would follow suit. Everybody's waiting for the next man to take action. So all we got to do is just freaking take action, man. As soon as people that love our cause and are supportive of our cause see us doing it, they're going to follow suit.
Hey, Patriot standing by. Thank God I seen your video this morning, because I would have totally forgotten. See, here in Kentucky, a strange thing is happening too. Look at that phenomenon up there. It's where the sun, it kind of hazes behind the clouds. That's exactly what happens when it's time to take over the fucking government.
Obviously, a lot of Trump supporters viewed The FBI raid, which was completely legal, was not an overreach. It was holding politicians accountable for committing crimes that Donald Trump wanted to punish Hillary for, crimes that Donald Trump said, hey, we need to actually make a felony, and he passed 2 laws to make a felony, punishing him for the crimes that he agreed are illegal, wrong, and should be punished harder, punishing him for those crimes. But the response to this has been quite, violent in threats and even in action. There were a ton of threats to the judge who actually ended up signing off on the warrant. There's been threats to the FBI, a huge spike in threats to the FBI that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security has been warning about for a bit now. And Trump doesn't really seem to care to quiet down the rhetoric. In fact, he hasn't really responded to these threats at all or tried to dial it down. Instead, he's actually ratcheted up his attacks on the FBI and calling this a politicized attack, even though, again, there is zero evidence that there was any wrongdoing during the conduct of this raid, when the raid was being approved by a judge, when probable cause was found, or that this was some political attack from the Biden administration who didn't even know the raid was happening beforehand. So I would say, recently, the FBI raid has played a massive part. I think a big part of this also is just social media. As I've talked about before on this channel, social media will feed you more of what you like. They want to keep you on the platform as long as possible. So if you like a post that says, maybe a civil war is coming, it's going to now serve you more posts about a civil war coming. And before you know it, if you liked 1 or 2 because maybe you were slightly entertaining the idea because you saw some divisive rhetoric in the news the other day, or you saw this FBI raid, before you know it, your social media feed is just flooded with cause to bring about a second civil war, that a civil war is coming. And then all of a sudden, look at you, you think everybody's talking about a civil war coming when, again, that's just social media playing to what you interact with, which, yeah, a call to civil war is going to get a lot of interactions on social media. So I think part of this, the reason why a lot of people believe civil war is coming, is social media putting them in isolated bubbles. I think obviously a big part of it, and something that concerns me the most, was January 6th. A lot of people believed, very falsely, very wrong, there's no evidence to back this up, but that the election in 2020 was illegitimate, Joe Biden is an illegitimate president, that the election was stolen, and that the rightful president is Donald J. Trump. And when I say a lot of people believe this, I mean a significant number of Republicans believe this. In fact, a majority of Republicans believe this nonsense. And if you believe that an election was stolen, if you believe that we're descending into a dictatorship, if you believe any of the nonsense around January 6th, then violence all of a sudden becomes rational. The irrational becomes rational if you believe that our election has been stolen. Because at that point, you believe that our democracy's gone. And if our democracy was actually gone or being stolen from us, violence is a responsible and understandable response to that. For example, I completely respect the people in Myanmar who are fighting against the military junta after the democratically elected government was thrown out. Why? Because they're fighting an actual dictatorship. But that's also what makes January 6th so malicious, is because those lies were fed to them because the president at the time, Donald Trump, was coping and seething and couldn't accept the fact that he was molding about him losing the election, and he lost. He couldn't accept his loss. He projected it onto his audience. He projected it onto his base, even before the election happened, talking about beforehand that if I lose, the election's stolen, yada, yada, yada. That led to a lot of people believing him, a lot of his devoted followers, or as I call them, cultists, believing him. And they took it to its logical conclusion, which is, well, if our democracy is being stolen, we need to stop it. How do we stop it? Go to Washington. Okay, we're in Washington. How do we stop it now? Charge! They're certifying the election. Speaking of January 6th, let me talk about an NPR poll that came out this January. 64% of the American population believes that U.S. democracy is in crisis and is at risk of failing. Now, of course, that's interesting. But what's even more interesting is the breakdown, because it points you in the direction where a lot of this concern is coming from. That sentiment is felt most acutely by Republicans. 2/3 of the GOP respondents agree with the verifiably false claim that voter fraud helped Joe Biden win the 2020 election, a key pillar of the big lie that the election was stolen from the former president, Donald J. Trump. Fewer than half of Republicans say they are willing to accept the results of the 2020 election, a number that has remained virtually unchanged since NPR asked the same question last January. Nearly 2/3 of poll respondents agree that U.S. democracy is more at risk now than it was a year ago. Among Republicans, that number climbs to 4 in 5. Overall, 70% of poll respondents agree that the country is in crisis and at risk of failing. Now, of course, the Democrat respondents are going to be responding, I believe the country's at risk of failing due to the authoritarian nature of Donald Trump, due to what happened on January 6th and possibly another coup attempt in the future, while Republicans are going to be responding. This is not, of course, a monolith, but this is the majority that are going to be saying this. They're going to be saying that our democracy is a crisis, it's dying, etc. It's going to be, oh, the election was stolen, all the voter fraud, 2020, it's going to be the big lie stuff. So when you look at all of the data, when you look at the political environment we find ourselves in after the 2020 violence in the election that was disputed by the former president of the United States, it's not too hard to understand why so many people are concerned about the safety of our democracy and about us devolving into a second civil war. But I will say that a lot of the people who say they're concerned about us devolving into a second civil war, and I do need to say this, feel more giddy about the idea. Like all those people on TikTok we were talking about earlier, I don't think any of those people are genuinely that upset about going into a second civil war. I think they might feel that there was some injustice done. They might buy the nonsense, but a lot of them seemed very, very, very excited to pick up a rifle and shoot their neighbor. And I think a lot of these people have been playing militia games and war games in their backyard for the last 20 years, and they just want the opportunity to kill somebody. Now, I'm going to pop this bubble. And I'm going to make the argument that I think the odds of us devolving into a second civil war are very, very, very low. And I'm sorry if I'm not giving you your hot take alternative media nonsense. I'm sorry if I'm not giving you your hot headline to, pull in all the viewers. But I just want to be a realist with you guys, that the odds of the United States devolving into a civil war, or that civil war being maintained for any more than maybe like a week after the U.S. military comes in and sieges the rebels, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how it's probably not going to happen. First off, let's talk about January 6th and the violence that occurred there. While it is true that there are people who defend what happened on January 6th and give it a thumbs up, that percentage is actually very, very small. Only 6% of people say it was a reasonable protest, what happened on January 6th. Now, the real place where there's division is whether they call it an insurrection and a coup, or whether they call it a violent protest or a riot. But there is little agreement on a better description. More than half of Democrats say that January 6th was an assault on or an attempted coup or insurrection, while Republicans are more likely to describe it as a riot that got out of control. And while I will say, like, calling it a riot that got out of control, I think is a little bit of an understatement. And I disagree with that, and I agree with the Democrats who responded to this poll. That's not an endorsement of behavior. Only 6% of the population believes that what happened on January 6th was justified, which is a astronomically small number. And you cannot overthrow the country with that little support. And you're not going to be able to wage a guerrilla war against the United States military or sustain yourself for any long period of time, or even in the popular media, with that 6% support. It's just not possible. While it is true, people have whitewashed January 6th and some people might look the other way, there's a massive difference between looking the other way and actively participating in violence and encouraging violence. I'll also say that those same January 6th protesters is putting it lightly, are getting punished harshly if they committed crimes on the day of and, participated in an attempt on our democracy. And this is good. This is very good. Let's talk about the sentences we're getting. We're seeing, on the low end, we're seeing like 1 month, right? With Grace Dawn Courtwright, who, went into the Capitol and posted photos of herself with the words, "Infamy is just as good as fame," and posting that on social media, which then people took those social media posts and, of course, sent it to authorities, which led to her getting arrested because, again, if you're storming the Capitol, if you got tricked about this big lie nonsense, you're usually not the sharpest tool in the shed. Now, she got a month in prison, and that's on the low end. Like, she stole a sign, she went onto the Capitol grounds, she did stuff that she was not supposed to do. She went into the Capitol, she was in restricted parts of the building, she stole a sign, she was, encouraging the violence. Bad, she got a month in prison, and that's the low end. But what I was looking at when I was going through these cases is a decent amount of these protesters are getting like 40 plus months in prison, and I mean years in prison. In fact, we actually just had a case finish talking about Guy Raffetti, who was convicted at trial and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Now, this guy was a recruiter for the Texas 3%ers, which is a militia group, a far-right militia group that has advocated for violence in the past. He was convicted March 8th of 5 felony offenses. These included obstruction of Congress as it met to certify the 2020 election results, interfering with police, carrying a firearm to a riot, and threatening his teenage son. We're going to get back to that part, because this part is really reprehensible, and it came to bite him in the ass. The U.S. District Judge, Daubrey L. Friedrich, who is, by the way, a 2017 Trump appointee, because Trump appointees are sentencing a lot of these people to long prison sentences. They're not being light on them, they're being harsh on them, which I also think is a good precedent. It was also a Trump appointee that ended up giving a thumbs up to the Trump raid, which is also good precedent if you wanted to look at the idea of our institutions not necessarily being completely captured by authoritarians. But that Trump appointee condemned his conduct and handed down an 87-month sentence, saying in nearly 6-hour hearing that his views espousing political violence were absurd, delusional, and a way outside of the mainstream. What Rafferty and others did at the Capitol is the antithesis of patriotism, Frederick said, adding that not only are they not patriots, they are a direct threat to our democracy and will be punished as such. Now, this was a guy who played a central role. This is a guy who played a central role in storming the Capitol. He was at the head of the mob, like storming past cops, pushing past cops, trying to get into the building. He was at key choke points throughout the day between police and Congress people. And after the riot, after all the violence was said and done, he wasn't done threatening violence. He wasn't done trying to intimidate people like he tried to intimidate our legislators who were trying to, help democracy function by allowing Joe Biden to become president. He then went on to threaten his son, like we said earlier. After the riot, he warned his son and 16-year-old daughter that if you turn me in, you're a traitor and traitors get shot. Now, it was his son who actually testified that at trial, and it was also his son who ended up turning him in.
A federal judge has sentenced a January 6th rioter to 7 years in prison, which is the longest sentence so far for participants in the Capitol insurrection. Sentencing for Guy Reffitt comes nearly 20 months after he brought a gun to the Capitol and threatened House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Back in March, a D.C. jury convicted Guy of 5 felonies. Here's how Reffitt's daughters reacted to his sentencing.
To mark my dad as this horrible person, and then having him prosecuted like this when somebody is maybe even able to get elected again, doesn't seem right to me.
Trump deserves life in prison if my father's in prison for this long.
Joining us now is Guy Reffitt's son, Jackson Reffitt. Jackson warned the FBI about his father both before and after the insurrection. Jackson, thank you so much for being with us this morning. How are you feeling? How are you reacting to this sentence?
I'm not happy at all, and I haven't been happy through this whole situation. No one in my family has either. But to say I'm surprised would be a lie. Everything my dad did, he's his own person, and his action has consequences. But I'm not happy at all.
I would also say the FBI raid and the lack of a mass organized violent response is also a good sign for our democracy and the idea that a civil war is not coming. I mean, when you think about the different things that could set off like far-right militias to try to overthrow the government, one of the ones on the top of the list would be trying to pursue criminal charges against Donald Trump and put him behind bars for the crimes he's committed. And raiding his home is the most direct example of that to date. And while that's led to a lot of threats of violence, which is terrible and needs to be condemned, it needs to be condemned 100%. None of it's been on the mass scale and none of it's been organized when it comes to the violence actually being carried out. The only instance we saw led to some crazy-ass schizophrenic going to an FBI Cincinnati office, firing everywhere with a nail gun before getting taken out by police after fleeing the scene. And while that's terrible and it's bad and it's weird that somebody would martyr themselves for the former host of The Apprentice, it's not a sign of things to come when you consider like armies rising up against the federal government. That guy is not leading troops in the battle. That guy is just walking towards his own doom. Not to mention, it's also good to see former presidents held accountable for, violating the law. When that happens in a lot of other democratic societies, that's good. And I know a lot of people tried to paint it like it was a bad thing, like it was a sign of a creeping authoritarianism. Other democracies have persecuted former presidents for their crimes before. And in fact, when it comes to the American system of governance, treating everyone equal before the law is one of the key pillars of what makes our democracy great. I would also like to say that the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the White House are all taking the right-wing terror threat, the threat of domestic terror in the United States, more seriously than they probably have not even in a long time, I mean like in forever. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security 2020 Homeland Threat Assessment. This is something that was brought up together by Chad Wolf, who is the Homeland Security Chief. As Americans, we all have the right to believe whatever we want, but we don't have a right to carry out acts of violence to further those beliefs. The department works with our government, non-government, and private sector partners to prevent individuals from making this transition from protected speech to domestic terrorism reflected by violence. As Secretary, I am concerned about any form of violent extremism. This is why we design our programs to be threat agnostic, ensuring that we can combat a broad range of domestic threats. However, this is the important part, I am particularly concerned about white supremacist violent extremists who have been exceptionally lethal in their abhorrent and targeted attacks in recent years. I am proud of our work to prevent terrorizing tactics by domestic terrorists and violent extremists who seek to force ideological change in the United States through violence, death, and destruction. This is important for a few reasons, but I'll just state the main reason. The main reason is that historically, the terror threat that the FBI and Department of Homeland Security has looked into has usually been the left-wing terror threat. But I think there's been a sort of come to Jesus moment after January 6th, and we've seen a lot of the FBI as resources, the Department of Homeland Security, and the White House direct its resources towards researching the right-wing terror threat and trying to deal with it, which is a good thing because the majority of terror attacks in the United States are committed by right-wing extremists. That's a fact. I'm not saying this to bully any of my conservative viewers, which I know I have a decent amount of. I'm just saying that because it's true. The Department of Defense actually got in a lot of controversy for trying to deal with the threat of extremism within the military by ordering a stand-down order for just a day so they could distribute training materials to people to help them identify extremism and deal with it in the military. This actually produced a right-wing backlash because, of course it did. I actually had a debate about it a while ago. And the White House has probably taken it more seriously than any White House historically has. On Joe Biden's first day in office, he actually directed his national security team to lead a 100-day comprehensive review of the U.S. government's efforts to address domestic terrorism, which has evolved in the most urgent terrorism threat the United States faces today. This is from the White House website. As a result of that review, the Biden administration is releasing the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. This is a 32-page document. It's not too long. It's not too complicated. You can go check it out yourselves. I actually recommend you go check it out yourselves. But I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis. This national strategy for countering domestic terrorism found that the two most lethal elements of today's domestic terrorism threat are, number one, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race, and two, anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists such as militia violent extremists. The comprehensive strategy provides a national and nationwide framework for the U.S. government and partners to enhance domestic terrorism analysis and improve information sharing throughout law enforcement, prevent domestic terrorism recruitment. This includes online terror recruitment, which they've not done a lot of research into in the past. This is a more modern phenomenon. And mobilization to violence, disrupt and deter domestic activity as well, and confront long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. And when talking about that contribution to domestic terrorism, what is something that's a long-term contributor, why is people joining these movements, it by name just says bigotry, racism, these xenophobia, these types of things are contributing to recruitment numbers for these organizations and contributing to extremism in the United States, which leads to terrorism. So I will say that while it might not go as far as I would want the government to go, I might want them to go a little bit further, they are taking this much more seriously than governments have in the past, which is a good thing for trying to combat any possible civil war or a rise in right-wing or left-wing or any wing extremism that could lead to people dying in terror attacks. I will say, though, that a concern for me, which the White House tried to address on the White House website, is these tactics not crossing over people's civil liberties. I don't think anything they've done so far and anything that they've posted, any of these reports, shows any trampling on civil liberties, and they emphasize it in the reports and on the White House website that they don't want to do that, but that is a concern we need to have moving forward when trying to talk about how to stop civil wars, how to stop terror attacks, and making sure we do it while respecting people's civil liberties and privacy. I do also want to say that a lot of people are saying that this level of of violence is unprecedented in American history, and I would say no, that is almost certainly not the case. If you look at the Reconstruction period and the amount of terror attacks that came from the Klan trying to, terrorize black people, that was extremely massive and extremely brutal. You could look at Black Wall Street being burnt to the ground and terrorism instances throughout American history. You could look at the 70s, which actually had a massive explosion in terror attacks. I actually read you some data from the 1970s and compare it to some more modern data. In the United States, terrorism has declined dramatically since the 1970s. In that decade, 1,470 incidents of terrorism unfolded within the nation's borders, and 180 people were killed. A total of 214 acts of terrorism were cataloged between 2002 and 2013 on U.S. soil, killing 61. I do want to say that there has been a slight spike since this 2002 to 2013 decade time period that they studied here, but it has not gotten anywhere close to the 1970s. And I don't want to go too deep into like the Weather Underground movement and like the type of terrorism that was happening during the 1970s, but I can assure you that the 1970s was not a time of peace and tranquility that you're going to see a lot of times on, sitcoms from the era. But lastly, I want to talk about the real risk to civil war, because I do think there is a risk of civil war. I just think the risk is very small, and we're not like, this isn't, if we're going towards civil war, this isn't 1860, it's 1830, 1840 right now. I think when it comes to like the timeline of what needs to happen, I think, for example, we're in the Bleeding Kansas period. We're not in the necessarily shooting at each other at Gettysburg period. I think first off, a big threat, I think, to our democracy and causing a civil war, and could cause a civil war, is what I've brought up multiple times, and that is the lack of trust in our elections and the big lie. If people keep approaching every election with the perspective of, if my candidate loses, then this is illegitimate, that is something that will create crises after crises after crises every election, and it could mess with the peaceful transferal of power, which could create a crisis, which could actually spark a civil war. That is a massive risk. And the people who could then, facilitate this type of move to try to actually challenge the peaceful transition of power could be, secretaries of states, which a lot of people who are getting elected across the board in many states across the country believe in the big lie. Secretary of States, governors, you get the idea. In fact, over 100 Republican primary winners support former President Donald Trump's false claim of election fraud. And this year, some counties have even refused to approve primary results. Now, this is concerning when we see people like Kari Lake rise up from the ashes, when we see this presence of this 2020 trutherism, because it means that these are people who just have rejected all the facts, have accepted an alternate reality, so their person can win an election in their head, and now they're going to try to project that on the rest of us because they couldn't finish cope and seething about 2020. And that endangers national security. Absolutely it does. Because if you stop that peaceful transfer of power, and you get people elected into positions like Secretary of State or governor in states like Arizona, which Kari Lake is running for, that's a swing state. That can have a real impact. And if we start seeing fake electors popping up everywhere, if we start seeing politicians moving towards trying to stop that peaceful transition of power, you can have a real violent incident that spirals out into full-blown combat. Again, I would like to point out that the odds of something like that succeeding are very small. It didn't succeed in 2020, which was great. There's checks and balances in place. There's other election officials outside of who's going to be Secretary of State of Arizona and who's going to be Governor of Arizona. There's going to be courts that will have to look into this. In fact, that instance I was talking about on how there was these people who didn't want to, certify the election results, these election officials, in 2 days, a court looked at it, said this is ridiculous, threw it out, and the election was certified anyway. So there are checks and balances in place. Hopefully those don't get whittled down. When they do start to get whittled down, that's when you can actually get scared, when those checks and balances start to get whittled down further. That's not to say that we shouldn't be scared at the premise of anyone getting elected into office who would just reject the results of a democratic election. I'll say a big concern for me is politicians making more ties with organizations like the Proud Boys or the Three Percenters. As a national organization, they're kind of defunct, but they still got local chapters. In fact, I think it was a state representative who was actually the husband of a sitting congressperson who actually had like 3%er decals. Again, far-right militia, which engaged in a lot of violence on January 6th, on the back of their truck. And they actually had to answer for why they had this type of symbolism, why they had these militias which engaged in violence on January 6th, why they had their symbols on their vehicles. And seeing organizations like the Three Percenters or the Proud Boys or any violent organization that was engaged in organized violence on January 6th in an attempt to overthrow an election, that is something that concerns me, because that could actually be the start of planning. That could be the start of like putting pieces into place for you to make a violent, organized attempt. Because what we saw on January 6th, while there was militias that had plans and there was some organization, a lot of the triggers on that wasn't pulled or it wasn't enough. But next time, a lot of those people would try to not make the same mistakes, and they would try to get more contacts on the inside, possibly, like elected officials. That's something I'm very scared of. The biggest fear for me, like I've somewhat hinted at before, would be the slow capture of our institutions. It would be like, let's say that this raid that happened on Donald Trump's home, let's say we find out any problem with it. Or let's say there's not even a problem with it, but somehow, even though I really hope this isn't the case, and I don't think it will be the case, Donald Trump wins in 2024. He gets through the primary and beats Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, whoever it's going to be, most likely Joe Biden. He is going to use that raid on his home as a justification to purge people at the FBI, purge government bureaucrats at every level, and replace them with party loyalists. With loyalists not only to his party, but more importantly, to him. Donald Trump has said multiple times how important like loyalty is to him personally. And that whittling down of the people who are in these systems to like check and balance, making sure that whittling down of our systems, our blocks in place to stop people from, developing a dictatorship. That is something that could slowly create an event that spirals out into a larger civil conflict in the United States. It's also something that could lead to the taking away of our democracy and possibly the denial of a legitimately elected politician transcending to an elected office because the Republicans couldn't accept the fact that they lost. And I will say, I said earlier, only 6% of the nation approved of the violence that occurred on January 6th. That's still millions of people. It's not enough to take over the whole country. It's not enough to win enough elections or anything like that. But it's still a sizable percentage of the population. And a lot of those people can buy guns. A lot of those people can get weapons. A lot of those people could make plans. And they could lash out like that guy did at the FBI Cincinnati office. And that actually is my biggest concern. I don't think we're going to find ourselves on the precipice of a second civil war in the United States. I don't think that's happening. I think the odds of that happening are very low. But I do think we're about to see the face of a new wave of terrorism in the United States. I agree with the Homeland Security Department's assessments about this. I actually agree with a more recent article in The Atlantic talking about this, titled, "The New Era of Political Violence is Here." This was written by Tom Nicholas. I just want to read one passage from this article to close this out, because I think it really grasps at what I'm most scared about going forward in the United States. The United States now faces a different kind of violence from people who believe in nothing, or at least in nothing real. We do not risk the creation of organized armies and militias in Virginia or Louisiana or Alabama marching on federal institutions. Instead, all of us face random threats and unpredictable dangers from people among us who spend too much time watching television and plunging down internet rabbit holes. These people, acting individually or in small groups, will be led not by rebel generals, but by narcissistic wannabe heroes, and they will be egged on by cowards and instigators who inflame them from the safety of a television or radio signal, or from behind the shield of elected office. Occasionally, they will congeal into a mob, as they did on January 6, 2021. I just want to quickly say that it takes a lot of effort to produce these videos. I got to pay editors, thumbnails, I got to, feed myself, and we put a lot of effort into this. And I've actually relaunched my Patreon with new rewards. The biggest one I want to push is that I'm going to be posting a lot of, off-screen, kind of off behind the camera, behind the scenes type photographs from my time in Ukraine. Tell a lot of stories that I haven't really talked about too much publicly, give my thoughts on the war, and stuff that didn't really make the cut for the main stuff, but like the behind the scenes stuff. And the most recent post I made, I posted photos of a war crime I actually saw while I was in the Donbass, and talk about some volunteers I interviewed and Taiwanese aid that was delivered there. You guys have a good weekend. Remember to like, subscribe, and please comment. I'm working really hard on these videos, and the algorithm appreciates it. You guys have a good day. Feeling kind of funny, not the sharpest tool in the shed. Looking kind of dumb with a finger and her thumb in the shape of an L on her forehead. No, it don't stop. Okay, let me get back to this. I don't have a lot of time to shoot today. I shouldn't be doing that.